going to take a quick look at the history of strategic management. We are going to consider how strategy in ancient times and how military strategy can provide some insight into business today. And so we'll start with the quote that we have on the slide, which is that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So this illustrates the importance of understanding the history of strategic management quite well, which can be traced back thousands of years. And so studying it will give us great wisdom, and also maybe we can avoid some strategic mistakes that we have seen to be repeated over the centuries. And certainly, of course, the present today offers great lessons for strategy. We can study our competitors, but this video recording is going to talk a little bit about maybe two less obvious sources of wisdom, which is strategy in ancient times as well as military strategy. So maybe the earliest discussion of strategy is from the Old Testament in the Bible. About 3,500 years ago, Moses was facing a challenge after leading his fellow Hebrews out of enslavement in Egypt. And he was very overwhelmed as he was the sole planner, the sole strategist of this large nation. And he got some advice from his father in law. And based on that advice, he started delegating authority to other leaders. And so we see that today in organizations. A CEO, chief executive officer, who is the top leader, obviously, of a company, cannot make all of the decisions, manage all of the resources in a large organization. And so they give these strategic tasks to vice presidents and other C-level executives. And so for Moses, also, this command structure helped him concentrate on the biggest decisions. And they helped him implement the strategies that he had. And then we come to ancient China, where strategist and philosopher Sun Tzu offers some thoughts and ideas on strategy, emphasizing creative and deceptive aspects. And maybe Sun Tzu's best known work is The Art of War, which continues to be studied and read today by business and military leaders. And in this book, they describe these creative and deceptive strategies. And one of them is that we are best off winning a battle if we don't even have to fight in it. And one example of that would possibly be the computer and phone maker Apple in the United States. A lot of other different computer and tech businesses like Toshiba or Acer compete with one another based on price, right? And if you compete based on price, that will lead to price wars. And as you are reducing the price of your products that you're selling, you're cutting into profit. And instead of competing on prices, Apple is doing something different. They focus on developing different features for its products. And Apple now really has kind of a cult following to them. Apple products are still quite expensive, and often they can't even run software that other laptops or phones can run. But Apple is still successful, and they just calmly swim in their own swim lane, not competing really with other PCs. And so maybe Sun Tzu would admire Apple's approach here. And then we have a very famous example in the Trojan Horse. That's a difficult one for me to pronounce. Trojan Horse. So this story tells us that the Greek soldiers wanted to find a way to enter the gates of the city of Troy, and they wanted to attack the city from the inside. And so what they did was that they developed a ploy which involved creating a huge horse that was made out of wood. And inside this wooden horse, they held the soldiers. And the horse was gifted to the city, and the city accepted it. And night came around, and the Greek soldiers who were hiding inside the wooden horse, they came out and they opened the city gates for their own army. And then that led the Greek to a victory. And so today, when we say Trojan horse, we are talking about gestures that can seem to be kind, nice, and beneficial, but underneath there is some sort of a sinister, deceptive attempt or intent. A more noble approach, possibly, comes from King Arthur in Britain and his knights. And so what happened here is that, unlike the hierarchical approach that Moses was using, with sort of top and then levels underneath in that organizational structure, King Arthur considered himself to be one of his knights. And so him and his knights all had an equal say in how to set the strategy of the group. And so it is believed that King Arthur's group would meet at a round table, so that no voice at the table would be seen as more important than the other voices. So all of the voices had equal value. And I don't know, when you look at how executive meeting rooms look today, do you see round tables? Do you see rectangular tables? What does the furniture look like? I think oftentimes we see rectangular tables, and the person sitting at the head of the table would implicate or imply rather that that person is more important. The CEO is more important. I don't know. Is that a good strategy? So if you want to, you can just pause on this slide, and this one will give you a little bit of information of the stories, historical strategy stories that I just talked about. Just also want to point out here that the Greek verb strategos means army leader, and we do have the idea of stratego, from which or we get the word strategy from the idea of stratego, and it refers to the idea of destroying enemies through the effective use of resources. And that is possibly one of the most important things that executives do in organizations today, is to make decisions around resources, because they are finite while our needs are infinite. And so we have to make sure that we allocate these finite resources towards the best use, so that we have the best ROI, best return on investment. Okay, so to continue some of our lessons by our military strategy, I did define this on the prior slide, so jumping straight to point number 2 here. We're going to talk about Machiavelli and the book that was written some 500 years ago, and still thought to be a guide for how to conquer and how to rule. So this 1532 book, named The Prince, gives us some templates for how to win, or maybe how to be successful in government. And some of the suggestions from this 500-year-old book or so could be thought to be fairly obvious or devious. And so when we talk about the word Machiavellian today, we talk about acts of deceit and manipulation. And then we also have wars that can give us important lessons about strategic management. And so we have 2 wars that were fought on American soil that provide important lessons. In the late 1700s, we had the American Revolution, which pitted American colonies against the mighty Great Britain. And the Americans relied on, really at that time, non-traditional tactics, such as guerrilla warfare and strategic targeting of British officers. Although Great Britain at this time thought that these tactics were barbaric, later on they have become more widely used during war. The Americans received help from the French and the French Navy, and this also shows us that there is value in having strategic alliances. So, non traditional tactics and strategic alliances. And both are still used in strategy today. And then, about 100 years later, American turned on one another during the American Civil War. And so that was about 4 years of hostilities, and then the Confederate States surrendered to the Union. And even though people who look back at that war think that the Confederacy was thought, or think that the Confederacy had the more effective generals, the Union had greater resources, including factories and railroads. Apparently, Trojan Horse and railroads are difficult for me this morning. We also have two wars that were fought on Russian soil that we can gain some insight for today. So, first in the 1800s, there was a strong French invasion that was defeated. And that was partly because of the brutal nature of Russian winters. And then in the 1940s, that history repeated itself, and we had a similar ending that came onto the German forces during World War II. And so we had Adolf Hitler, and he went against advice from his leading generals, and he directed his army to conquer Russia. And like the French had done about 150 years earlier, the Germans were able to go deep into Russia geographically, so they advanced into Russia. And then, as we know from our opening quote, the Germans did indeed forget their past. And so the horrific winter, with its cold and miserable, encompassing and relentless snow and freezing temperatures, did stop the Germans' forward movement into Russia. And the Russian forces took control, and it is said that Hitler did commit suicide as the Russians came closer to his German capital, Berlin. And then finally, in ancient times, the Romans had assumed that no army could cross a mountain range known as the Alps. And so there was an enemy general named Hannibal, and Hannibal put his army on elephants. And on these elephants, they crossed the mountains and they caught the Roman forces by surprise, and they were completely unprepared. And we see this again by the French commanders in 1940, making similarly faulty assumptions. So Germany was invading Belgium and then France, and they had a strategy, the Germans had a strategy that caught the French forces completely by surprise. The French commanders believed that the German tanks could not make it through a very thick wooded region, so a lot of forest in the Ardennes forest. And so the French did not bother to prepare a strong defense over there by that wooded region, the Ardennes. So instead, what they did was that they put most of the French army and the British allies against a smaller divisionary force up north. And the Germans really had sent this force to be a deceptive force. And so that's where the French put most of its army and its focus. And then the German forces made it through the thick wooded forest. They encircled the Allied forces and started driving them toward the ocean. And thousands of French and British soldiers were killed or captured in this surprise maneuver. And now we can see that the French generals really did make a costly mistake. In retrospect, it's easier to say that when they made assumptions about what the Germans could and could not do, and the German strategy and actions. So we are not well behooved to make assumptions about what our enemy or our competitor can and cannot do. So executives who make assumptions about competitors will put our organizations at risk, right? So we have to be prepared and not think we know what is going on. And then we have, as a quick example, Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc. And Joan of Arc was known as a very aggressive military leader who operated with the perspective that the best offense is a good offense. Classic military strategy. Again, you can pause on this slide and read the further examples. So, what we can say on this slide is that major business decisions are often categorized as strategic, while smaller, more minor decisions, for instance, like are we changing the price, are we opening a new location, are referred to as more tactical decisions. So, with that, our key takeaways are that even though strategic management as a field of study has been developed mostly over the last 100 years, obviously the concept of strategy is much older than that. And strategic management can benefit greatly by understanding the lessons provided by ancient history and military strategy. Until next time, be well. Bye bye.